introduce. So as you see in this particular slide that I have, you know, one of the things that we learned as we introduced this topic was these mega constellations and the concerns that have been expressed over the past few days and certainly over the past 2 years. The thing that became pretty evident fairly quickly, it was that the framing, that the messaging, and possibly even some of the messengers, the terminology that's being used, the visuals that are being used, are not exactly things that they can, you know, get their attention, right? That they can, you know, understand. You know, we use terms SATCON, MegaConstellations, even the term space. You know, when you're talking about, you know, dealing with the issues of Earth environment, that's not really the terminology that we normally use. We don't talk about orbits. We talk about our atmosphere. That we certainly do, which is why we're so heavily involved in fighting for to reduce greenhouse emissions and protect the ozone and other parts of our atmosphere. So it became very evident in our conversations that that there was a need to make sure that this message resonates, that it intersects with other priority issues that they're already working on. You know, for example, how are these mega constellations, how, you know, could they help or not, or affect things that we're dealing with, whether it's biodiversity crisis, pollution of our waters, you know, the issues of environmental, racial, and social justice, which are so dear to our heart. We also realized that, you know, we're still in the pandemic. Here in Florida, the numbers are starting to rise up again. So part of it, it's a sense of, you know, nobody wants to deal with yet another crisis. You know, I live just a few miles away from Surfside. So, you know, and not far from Parkland. So there are times when we're just overwhelmed with crisis after crisis. And lastly, I say, you know, when we talk about this issue, to be honest, I think they look at me and they think that I'm crazy and that I'm talking like I'm talking about a Star Wars movie. It just doesn't sound real. So next slide. So one of the things that you know, we kind of need to first start with is understanding how do we define the environment? What is the environment on Earth? And it was very clear, you know, especially in the last few days, that, you know, a concern is rising as to who is defining, you know, what is the environment on Earth? You know, are we letting Earth science? Are we letting politics? Are we letting private companies define what is Earth? As a geoscientist myself, you know, having gone and I studied geology, and somebody who in fact wanted to be in space sciences and work for NASA and all these things, it was falling in love with my own planet, and really not just one thing. It's this a planetary system, a Terran system. So when we look at LEO satellites, if you refer to them as things that are orbiting, that are residing in our very own Earth's atmosphere, these are things that resonate. Because those of us that are working in environmental, ecological, climate advocacy, we recognize our atmosphere as part of Earth. And it's in fact why, you know, USGS, NASA, NOAA, they all recognize the Terran system, the Tierra system, as including even the magnetosphere. And, you know, there are obviously larger questions that are not going to be part of this work group, but, you know, I have to wonder whether we realize that, you know, would humans be impacted if we didn't have the moon and the sun, you know, if we messed them up? So we'll let that be part of another session. In this slide, what you're hopefully seeing again here is this incredible interconnection that we have. And I'm glad to know that it was in fact from Cape Canaveral here in Florida that the very first US satellites was launched that helped to discover the very frontier of our planet, you know, the Van Allen belts that make up the magnetosphere. Next slide. Then we thought, okay, what would get the environmental and ecological communities engaged? How do we make that relevant, right? And again, the first one of the first thoughts that came to mind is how much we incredibly much depend on the Earth observation satellites that are operating, those that are operating by NASA, by ESA, the European Space Agency, and other governments that have, that are really working in an amazing network. I mean, talking about cooperation, those that are operating the Earth observation satellites understand the incredible value of cooperation and sharing the data that comes from all of these satellites. So with that said, I want to say that any impacts to Earth observation satellites would be huge concerns. For decades, again, these satellites have helped humanity to understand, to protect the planet's atmosphere and all its ecosystems. They have exposed our vulnerabilities, including the limits of our very own natural resources. They gave us the evidence and now the means to monitor our progress or lack of in tackling the climate and the biodiversity crisis. We have become dependent on them to manage ecosystems, wildlife, agriculture, transportation, weather, water, air quality, light pollution, wildfires, disasters. Since outreach, unfortunately, has focused mostly on the astronomy community, almost no one working on environmental, ecological, and social justice is aware of the issues that thousands of new satellites in our atmosphere, low orbit, and all the extra space debris that could come with it, could bring to the very future of the very tools that space exploration has gifted us with to be able to sustain our own planet. That said, there were some initial questions that were asked of this community. Some of those questions included, who will bear the costs associated with tracking and mitigating the issues? Who will compensate for the loss and the reduction of benefits, if any of these EO satellites are compromised? Could cascading collision events, especially with on-track debris, could they destroy these critical satellites? Have the limits being identified of what we can put in orbits in our atmosphere? Will Earth observation satellites be prioritized? Or is it a first come, first served basis? So it seemed to most of us that spoke in this community that it seems that applying the precautionary principle is really the most responsible action that environmentally conscious corporations should take to avoid playing roulette with the future of really our one and our only planet, and instead invest in addressing the weaknesses that we have in our policies, and to study the direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts that a commercial race to occupy low Earth orbits in our atmosphere would do. And obviously engage the public meaningfully. And really, we need to stop hitting the rewind button that keeps playing the same environmental injustices over and over again, because at some point the music will stop. Next slide. So I want to give an example of how that concern is really not a Star Wars movie type scene. It was in fact in a year before the pandemic began, that there was a message from the European Space Agency that they had to conduct their very first ever collision avoidance maneuver in order to protect one of their own satellites from one of the first mega constellation from Starlink, and it was a very important Earth observation satellites. Is monitoring winds, aerosols, clouds, is helping us with our weather forecast, with climate research. It has a pretty short lifespan, 3 years. In fact, it probably already has the 3 years. And so it has to be replaced, right? So a year into its operation, there was a risk of potential collision. There was a problem you know, just because humans are imperfect, and just like all humans, Starlink operators are imperfect. And unfortunately, we weren't able to reach them on time, work out how they were going to avoid it, the potential collision. And again, it doesn't mean that they were going to collide, right? There's these thresholds that all of these companies share, because a collision will be so catastrophic. You need to say the threshold very, very conservative. And that risk was 10 times higher.
3 minutes, Diana.
Thank you for reminding me. So this is an example of, you know, again, why this is so important. Next slide. Okay. So the other thing for the environmental, ecological, and opportunity to engage and to, you know, to be able to make this all relatable, you also need to understand the impacts that basically this space race is doing on communities, on our ecosystems and our wildlife. And I'm using just 2 examples because we happen to have people in the Sierra community that are already affected by this. In particularly in Boca Chica, in Brownsville in Texas, there's been a lot of issues with explosions, you know, issues with gentrification. Next slide. You know, recognition that there are people that in fact live in there. And I invite you to check this link to find out all the other different things that they're going through. And next slide. Okay, because what I fear is that what Brownsville is going to go through, which is also in, you know, there's an amazing estuary there right at the very edge with Mexico, is Cape Canaveral is right by the Indian River Lagoon. And the Indian River Lagoon is right now in a crisis. And part of the reason why it is in a crisis is because of sprawl that has been driven itself by the space industry. And you just have to search the word manatees and you'll see all the different deaths that we have going on. Next slide. So there's a lot of other issues that we are concerned about. You know, I'll be glad to answer more questions during the Q&A later, but I do want to draw attention to the fact that wildlife, we have no idea yet how these potential satellites in, you know, how they might disrupt the navigation of wildlife. And to anybody who thinks that it's crazy for wildlife to use the stars for navigation, just remember that humans did not have GPS for most of our existence. So the way that we did get around was in fact using the stars, because not even all of humanity had compasses. Next slide. And the last thing I'll say is, you know, about 100 or so years ago, people thought that our ocean was really huge, that we could just put whatever we could in there. We could put waste debris, we could put plastics, we could put anything and everything in there. In fact, that we can even dump space junk into it. The fact is that our ocean has limits, and so does the ocean above us in our atmosphere. So I hope we don't repeat the same mistakes. Thank you.